Hello there, Dr. Patricia Coughlin again, just talking to you about ways to get better at what you do as a psychotherapist. Um, I was just reading this really interesting book called Choke, and it's all about top performance, right? What are those qualities and characteristics of the top performers compared to those who choke? So, again, if you think about sports, even people who might be really good in practice, when they get into the race, they choke and they're not able to perform up to potential, right? So, what can we learn about this? Well, one of the most interesting studies that was talked about in this book, and it wasn't just about athletes by any means. In fact, they were looking at engineers and physicists and different sorts of professions. What was the difference between the high performing experts and people who were more in a beginning phase of their profession? And one of the most important things they found was the amount of time the person spent trying to understand the problem before attempting a solution. That beginners tended to jump to conclusions, to take one or two pieces of evidence, right, as, oops, I've got it, let's go. And the experts took their time. They really explored the problem and tried to understand it before coming up with any solution. And I think you can see the relevance of this for psychotherapy practice, that we spend time digging into and really trying to understand the nature of the problem before coming up with some attempt at a therapeutic solution. The other part of this is that this is something you want to be doing in collaboration with the patient, so that the two of you together are trying to understand and agree on the nature of the problem. And it turns out that, again, this is one of the key factors in developing a strong collaborative alliance, that the therapists who tend to get the best outcomes get this agreement about the problem, the goal, and the task. And they do that pretty early on. Now, I've studied with Dr. Davanloo, and I do ISTDP, intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. And again, perhaps somewhat paradoxically, in order to work effectively in a short term, you actually have to give yourself quite a lot of time at the beginning. And he advocated setting aside at least 3 hours for the initial session with a patient. And there's quite a lot of data to suggest that the longer you spend with a patient in that first contact, the better your outcomes are going to be. I mean, think about it. The average patient has waited a year between the onset of their symptoms and difficulties and finally calling a therapist, right? So a lot has built up within them. And just imagine only having 45 or 50 minutes for that first contact. How are you going to get any depth of understanding as to what's going on with the patient, and also, to have some kind of therapeutic impact? So by giving yourself a longer, at least 2 hours, and preferably 3, you're going to have time to understand the nature of the problem, the current precipitants, and actually begin to work on that together so that the patient leaves having had an actual therapeutic experience, right? Not sort of waiting for that and just doing, a history or something in that first session. So the other thing I wanted to mention was some research by Johan Munson and Ronstadt on the difference between successful and unsuccessful therapies with the same therapist. Okay, so they studied, I think it was 15 therapists, and looked at their successful cases and their unsuccessful cases to try to decipher what was the difference and how soon could you tell that it was off track in those unsuccessful cases. And in fact, they did find from the very first session that therapies that ended up being unsuccessful, not only were the therapist and patient not able to get this agreement on what they were going to do together and how they were going to do it, but they actually co-created a hostile atmosphere. And it seemed as though these therapists were somehow vulnerable to reacting themselves in a negative, hostile way to the patient's, either the patient's skepticism about the process or their own negative feelings and reactions. This is another thing that distinguishes the best therapists from the rest. They seem to be able to deal with these negative feelings and reactions in their patients with aplomb. So since this is so important, and at least in my training, I don't think I ever got any kind of training on how to deal with such negative feelings. This is something that you really want to focus on and prepare for. Again, like I mentioned in my last video, if you videotape your work, you're going to have a chance to replay those difficult moments and kind of role play and improv. How might you deal with that differently? So I think about one of my favorite examples of a patient who had had many therapies before and came to see me. And as I began to ask him about the nature of his problems and the history of it and so on, he rolled up his sleeves, sat forward and said, maybe this whole psychotherapeutic procedure is just a crock of horse shit. Now, that's pretty provocative, right? And if you take that personally, and if you feel threatened or like he's somehow calling your competence into question, you're going to get activated, right? Your own feelings, your own anxieties and insecurities, and it's going to make it pretty hard for you to respond in a positive way. And I remember in that case, I certainly wasn't going to get into a debate about it, but I just said, yeah, you don't know, right? And that's why you're here, right? To find out, could this method of treatment and working with me possibly help? So, let's see, right? So I didn't get defensive and I also didn't get hostile. And it kind of reminds me of, I saw a demonstration of Aikido one time, and it really struck me. In Aikido, which is a martial art, they talk about going with the force of the attacker. So instead of trying to resist that or fight back, which is very difficult if someone's coming at you, they suggest you just go with. And if you do that, it's actually smooth and easy, and you use their energy, and the whole thing gets dispelled relatively easily. So how can we do some sort of emotional Aikido? If somebody comes at us, could you actually join them and say, yeah, I mean, gosh, you've tried therapy umpteen times and haven't gotten any response. Of course you'd think it's a crock of horse shit, right? It looks like you have a lot of feelings about that, right? So can you actually go with it and make use of it? Okay, so again, just sort of recapping, right? We're talking about how important it is to get an agreement about the problems and the tasks and the goals in therapy, how we have to have our own emotional kind of equilibrium and not get activated, because and it was in particular, if therapists were belittling or ignoring patients, this set up a really hostile atmosphere and predicted negative outcome. And that you do want to give yourself time to, especially in that first contact, to understand deeply what the nature of the problem is so that you can formulate the case and then develop a therapeutic strategy for intervention. So I hope these comments, these reflections are helpful to you, and I look forward to hearing from you.